Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Eric Luper. He's written a new book. It's a young adult novel. It's called Bug Boy, just in time for the Saratoga season. It's about a 15-year-old jockey in the summer of 1934, so it's also a historical novel. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start talking about your book and young adult literature, I thought you could maybe give us the capsule biography, I like to say. I know you're not from this area, but maybe you could tell us how you ended up here and became a YA author.
Originally, I I grew up in New Jersey, went to Rutgers University, and and then ended up going to chiropractic school. I went to chiropractic school out in Seneca Falls, New York, in the Finger Lakes. And a friend of mine from school grew up in Bolton Landing, and so quite frequently we would do our weekends up in Lake George. And I met my future wife, actually, in Lake George, and she's an attorney, and she argues better than I do. So when it came to deciding where we lived, she won. The first of many discussions, I suppose. So I relocated up here and began to write.
Okay. Were you still a chiropractor then? Or?
I am still a chiropractor.
Oh, you still are?
I still am, yeah.
Oh, all right. I thought this was a new...
Well, you know, lots of balls in the air, just juggling them.
Well, this, your book is called, I guess it's technically called a YA novel. That's called young adult. And I guess librarians define it one way, publishers define it one way, bookstores define it one way. I'm sure authors probably define it yet another. So is there a definition to young adult literature, or is there...
I like to define young adult literature with an extremely broad brush. And, you know, really the only criteria that I use to distinguish what's young adult and what's not is the age of the protagonist. Because aside from that, there's really very little difference between an adult book and a young adult book.
So you're, like, in this book, Jack is 15.
15.
Okay, so your criteria is just protagonist. What about, you were talking to me before we started about, is marketing play part of this?
Well, decisions are made that are outside of the author's hands as to where the book will be shelved. And you know, you have books like The Life of Pi. You have books like Lovely Bones and A Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. All have very young protagonists and all fit any person's criteria of what a young adult novel technically is. It's just a matter of where the publisher decided to recommend it be shelved.
Now, those three all became big bestsellers, and in our library they're down in the adult section. I don't know in bookstores where you'd find them, but...
Life of Pi, you'll find two separate covers in both the adult and the young adult sections.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, they released one. I'm pitching someone else's book. This is interesting. But they did release a version of the novel that actually had illustrations and ended up in the young adult section.
Okay.
It's really a beautiful version.
For Life of Pi.
For Life of Pi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you were talking before about in the bookstores, the YA section, young adult, is the only one that's expanding or growing, you're saying?
In the past few years, young adult, they call it a renaissance, but I really think of it as a birth, because things are happening in young adult literature that have just never happened before. Renaissance means rebirth.
Yeah.
To me, it's just a birth because it's such an explosion of talent coming through the young adult genre now.
Well, in fact, actually, I think there's a lot of adult authors, famous authors that we all would know. James Patterson, Robert Parker, they're all starting to get in on the YA scene. Right. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and those books are extraordinarily popular.
So your book is called Bug Boy. Now it's about a jockey in Saratoga racetrack in the summer of 1934. So why did you choose, I mean, your first book is called Big Slick. It's about a teenager and having a gambling problem, is that addiction? So, and that was in modern times or current.
Contemporary.
So why did you got two things going on here. You have historical and YA, for lack of a better Why did you choose maybe this route this time to set it in 1934?
It was an interesting journey for me. Originally, I wanted to write a contemporary novel about the track. Living in the shadow of Saratoga, there's so much history here that I started doing my homework, and I started reading different books about sort of decade by decade of how Saratoga evolved. And 1934 is a pertinent year. It's a really interesting year. And when I started reading about the history of the track, 1934 kept coming up over and over as a significant year. It was the first year Prohibition was lifted. It was the first year that the bookies were permitted to come into the confines of the track after a long layoff.
Did they still have betting windows then?
No, they had they had trolling bookies, and then there was if you're facing the track to the left side, there was a big pavilion over there where the bookies had little stands, and they would have chalkboards, and they would write the odds for the different races, and people could either come down, or there were people who would come up and down the stands. And
so they all had their own.
Every bookie had different odds, and different bookies had different levels of success.
Well, before 1934. How did people bet? I mean,
before 1934, there was a period of time, and I don't recall the years, where the bookies had to stay outside of the confines of the track. And so if you wanted to place a bet, you would have to go outside the gates.
Were they just standing right outside the
Pretty much, yeah. And my understanding is they had a lot of sort of incognito people kind of walking through taking the bets, but it wasn't approved for them to come in. But 1934 was also the first year they used an automatic starting gate.
I know that, and that plays a big part in the book.
Yes. And it's just an interesting time because of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
It's in the height of the Great Depression, and when I started writing the book, it was before we had our own sort of economic downturn, but I suppose I just stumbled into something that's extraordinarily relevant for what we're experiencing today.
Well, you highlight the sort of rich versus poor. You mentioned like Canfield Casino, the Adelphi Hotel, Caroline Street. All these places are still there, and you do show how the rich people are really separate from. In fact, there's one scene in the book when they go down to Albany. And you describe them driving around like a shanty town in hobo villages. I don't know.
It was practically a caste system back then. I mean, the track workers were destitute, and it was a very difficult life for them to lead. And it was interesting to see the different strata of society. And you have these different classes working so close because the track, which attracts the extraordinarily rich people, doesn't exist without these completely destitute workers working behind the scenes. And so to me, showing both sides of that was really interesting.
It really comes through in the book, this class system, what you call it, and not only that, where these people are working, it's very dangerous. Not just jockeys, the rider, what they call the exercise rider, it's very dangerous, and that really comes through. So how did you come up with this main character? His name is Jack Walsh. Jack Walsh, right?
Yeah, Walsh,
yes.
You got it.
So how did you come up with this character and sort of his story that is to set it in motion, I guess?
He was, just like with my first book, it was sort of a mental exercise. I wrote my first chapter just batting ideas around, and it's very similar to the first chapter in the book now. There's obviously some changes, but I don't really get to know my characters until I start writing them. And then once I get my legs, so to speak, then I go back and I kind of fine-tune the detailing. So I started writing this chapter, or what I looked at the time as sort of a short story, just about the experience of riding that horse and exercising that horse in the morning. And I went from there.
So are you a horse racing fan? I mean, it really comes through your knowledge of the track and little things, and just, are you a fan?
I enjoy going to the races probably 3 times a year, 4 times a year. I'm not, an enthusiast. I wouldn't call myself an enthusiast, but I found the more I learned about the track, the more fascinating it was, and I did a lot of research at the National Museum of Racing up in Saratoga, as well as the libraries through the Saratoga area to learn about the
So
region.
there's a couple scenes in the book though where you, in the middle of a race, the jockeys are sort of hollering at each other. Does that
happens.
Did that really go on? And
That
like there's this
still
trash,
does.
there's like this trash talking going
Still does,
on, and
yes.
they whip the.
That doesn't happen so much anymore.
But maybe in the 30s.
Well, back then it was really common, and there weren't cameras back then to catch that sort of stuff. And now every angle you need to see those jockeys, you can see it, and the stewards can go back and check and see what happens. But back then, especially on the back stretch, as they were crossing, there was nobody back there, and you know, they had a few spotters, but aside from that, you know, these jockeys knew when to take opportunities and when it was safe.
Okay, so the arc, I want to talk about sort of the arc of the story here, I guess you could say, or I want to put it in the context of a YA novel because the main character doesn't really, for lack of a better, he doesn't really learn a lesson. It's not really, is this sort of new in YA that it's, you know, like for example, I don't think this gives anything away, but by the end he doesn't get the girl, he's estranged from his father, and he's suspended from racing for 2 years. That's how the book ends. So is this sort of a typical kind of, I don't know, is this like the old days, you always think of the main character has to learn something or come to some conclusions about life. It's more, does he just accepts the...
Well, I think that you need to draw your own conclusions. I mean, if you've read my first novel, there's some ambiguity there. But I believe that my character in my first novel, Andrew Lang, and the character in my second novel learned a great deal. Just because things don't work out the way that they had envisioned doesn't necessarily mean they didn't grow as a character.
Didn't learn, but they seem more accepting of how life might really be as opposed to...
Sometimes that's the conclusion that you need to reach.
But like I was saying, there's a lot of YA books. Do they tend to be more like this now, this more realistic as opposed to maybe, you know, I mean...
Well, back in the 80s, I mean, you know, I'm sort of a student of sort of the growth of the young adult genre. Back in the 80s, aside from a few exceptions, the bulk of young adult literature was what we called problem novels.
Yeah, that's what...
Where it was very easy to read books that had these high problems. You know, boy with drug addiction, messes up his life, and then boy enters 12-step program, everything's rosy.
Okay.
You know, boy or girl has, you know, some other, you know, anorexia, goes through rehabilitative program, and then you know, her life is rosy again. I think through the 90s, that changed, and the books became more of a reflection of real life. And I think that teens' radar for sort of the BS is very finely tuned. And back in the 80s when they were writing these problem novels, I think they took for granted how sophisticated these teens really are. And I think that they can bite into these more mature subjects, maybe that reflect reality a little more realistically, and take something from that more so than if it was just candy-coated and have the...
Well, your book, I would say, I mean, I'm sure you'll take it as a compliment, it really compares favorably, I think, to the Chocolate War in that...
I'll take that as a compliment.
The adults, I mean, it's the adults a lot of them are pretty bad in here, and in that book, of course, they were brothers at a Catholic school, but... And you know, that's kind of, I don't want to say your book is cynical or anything, but he really shows, you show the racing world as not all this, oh, you go up and have fun in bed. It's really a dog-eat-dog kind of world.
Well, I think, for me at least, the beauty of young adult literature, or at least writing to that age group, or having characters who are of that age, I mean, it's the same really, is that these children are passing from that ideal perception of what life is like to sort of the harsh reality of what life is like.
And of course, in this book, Jack is, as a jockey, he's in an adult world.
Yeah.
I mean...
And, you know, in Big Slick, it was the same. It was a boy who was playing poker in an illegal poker room filled with adults.
Oh, okay.
And so it's that transition from, you know, playing cap guns in your backyard where the good guys always win, to this really ugly underbelly of society. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm attracted to that when I write. I don't know.
Well, one thing about your book, you have Jack, in order to make the weight, you have him purging a lot. Can you maybe talk about, did that, I guess I should say, did that go on? I should say it probably still does.
It still does go on. In fact, jockeys, there's a great documentary where they outline exactly how these jockeys make weight. There's a chapter in Seabiscuit that talks about how jockeys make weight as well. And in a lot of these track bathrooms, they have a toilet just for purging.
Oh, really?
And no one uses it for anything but purging. They wear rubber sweatsuits, and they
go into hot box in one.
They go into hot boxes. It's really very. They take diuretics now. It's very unhealthy. And one of the big issues that the jockeys today are fighting for is to raise those imposts. In other words, a horse can only carry, let's say, a very fast horse can carry 130 pounds. Lesser horses carry as little as 114 pounds. That includes saddle, jockey, and clothing, and all equipment. So to get to that 110 pounds the jockey needs to be in order to make that 114-pound impost, they put themselves through some terrible ordeals.
in your book, I'll just tell people watching it, if they're going to read it, the scenes of this making the weight, they're very harrowing. I mean, they really are. I mean,
well, I have friends.
You describe the people that do this after many years, their teeth are
rot right out of their mouth, and that's reality. That's what happens. I mean, I grew up not knowing many jockeys, but I knew a lot of wrestlers, and wrestlers had to make weight as well. And I remember the gym teachers in my high school putting the kids down in the boiler rooms with these metallic suits on, and telling the students, if you tell this to your parents, you're off the team.
These are wrestlers.
These are wrestlers.
Yeah.
I mean, and these are kids.
All right. Well, that might be a good thing for a book. But back to the research. You have great little details in the book, which I didn't know about. This was the first year they had the starting gate. There's bookmakers. When the results were, the flag went up. I'm thinking there was no electric tote board. I don't know why I thought that.
It was a few years before the electronic tote board came. It was the year that Victoria Pool was just being built, so I put a scene right into there.
You mentioned Victoria Pool.
In fact, originally I had that very scene take place in Congress Park on the carousel, but after doing my research, I found out that the carousel, because of the Depression, was not doing very well, and they removed it. Okay. And so there was no carousel, so I had to go back and rewrite the scene. So I said, what else was interesting during 1934? It turns out that during the New Deal, that entire park was being built, and Victoria Pool was just nearing completion, so it was an interesting spot.
Well, one thing we were talking about before, I was going to say, well, who's the audience for this book? And you were telling me before we started how many adults now are reading YA books. I mean, people, if you're interested in Saratoga and history, now I think adults would like this book, but could you tell us about this, besides the 3 books you already mentioned, adults are now reading these YA kind of books?
Well, I wish they would more. Unfortunately, when the average adult sees young adult, they think
kids book,
or they think those are vampire books, those are bubblegum, beach reads. That's not for me. But there's some real great talent in the young adult section. Unfortunately, it's being overlooked because of this preconceived notion.
Okay, so maybe should we have a separate YA room in the library? Well, just put them right out there.
A lot of libraries are moving toward having
everything interfiled.
Yeah, interfiled. But then that creates other issues as well. So
because people always come in and say, "Where's the
young adult section?" Or they want to target themselves toward that age group. And so, I wish there was some way. And some libraries are moving toward what are called crossover sections. And so the crossover sections are the books that would be good for adults, but have younger.
That's just we need another section. In the
exactly. So it's just the only solution is to complicate things more, I suppose.
Well, could you tell us? You mentioned how, and I guess I see this as a librarian in the book world. We're always involved with books. We're really in a transitional phase or whatever in the publishing, print world, newspapers, books. What's this all about? I guess you could say how authors now are really doing more than just writing, putting the book out. They're really getting involved in more.
Writers.
And it's all technologically driven.
Many writers I know today are becoming more involved in promotions. I mean, I remember back in, when I was growing up, that, our teacher would make us write a letter to an author, and, 8 weeks later, 12 weeks later, you'd get something scribbled that you would never know if it was actually the author or somebody at the publishing company. And, that's essentially the extent to which you'd have an interaction with an author. Today, authors are far more accessible than ever, and I think authors are taking opportunities, but also taking their time and figuring out how this technology can best work for them. But accessibility to authors is better than it's ever been through things like Facebook and MySpace and Skype and other media. I mean, you can just go to an author's website and contact them directly. Oftentimes you'll hear back with them within a few days.
And I guess I'll tell people watching, it'll be like right here on the screen, ericluper.com.
Oh, yeah.
I was looking on it, you got a blog, there's a lot of fun stuff, and stuff about your books and where you're going to be. And
it's when you have a year to 2 years between a novel, it's important to keep your readers engaged in what you're doing and what's going on. Otherwise, especially with young adults, they cycle in your age group, and then they cycle out very, very quickly. And so it's important to keep them engaged in what you're doing.
But what I'm thinking, when I was a teen reader, I don't know if this is true for you, books, they really can mean a lot to you, way more. I mean, I could read a novel now and I would think, oh, that's really good, but when you're 15, 16, they really do mean something to you, and you end up reading them a lot. And back then, I guess if we had the internet, I'm sure I would have tried to email, whoever, to J.D. Salinger or somebody, or Lloyd Alexander was one of my favorites. But I guess back then I would have. Do you get a lot of emails from readers? And
I do, and one thing authors have to recognize is that not only are they competing on the shelves with thousands of other books, but they're competing with other forms of media. So, I mean, just as easily as someone can pick up a book, more easily they can turn on the TV, they can watch a movie, they can listen to music. And so I think that this movement of authors toward the technology is helping us compete with this sort of instant gratification that teens today like. And that's very important, especially for writers for younger audiences.
So one thing in your future, you were telling me that, I don't know if it's actually set up yet, but you're inviting either book groups or classes that maybe read your book together to go on Skype. That shows you, I'm not sure we even know if I know what this is, but and have sort of a conference with you or something. Tell us about how that might work. I know you haven't done it yet.
Skype is a form of video teleconferencing. Okay. And, so I can sit at my computer and I can talk with groups in Wisconsin without leaving a classroom. What schools are doing now is they're rigging their auditoriums with the computer so that they can have a camera in the auditorium. I can see the classroom. Okay. I can see the auditorium, and we can have a dialogue going back and forth. And what I'm offering to book groups and to schools and our classrooms who read one of my books is to have a 20-minute discussion
with
about
their
the book.
Group. And it could be not just a class, but the neighborhood book group.
Absolutely, and that's at no charge.
Now, has this been set up? Have you done it yet, or is it set up yet?
I've done it a few times.
Oh, all right,
it's working great. And there's a group of a whole group of children's authors who are doing that as well. So if anyone's interested, even for a younger group, I can put you in touch with people who can give you lists
and this
of
is on,
authors who are doing that.
Will this be on your website, ericluper.com?
Yeah, you can go to ericluper.com and contact me through there.
And then you can set up doing this on Skype.
It would be through Skype, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, geez, if we can only get, James Patterson or somebody to do that.
Don't tell them. I don't want the competition.
And I guess I couldn't. Before we end, I just want to tell people, this book has really good historical facts. If you're interested in Saratoga, you'll really like it. And and I say it compares to Robert Cormier's famous book, The Chocolate War. But I couldn't end without talking about. You dedicate the book to Frank Hodge, who was a teacher I had in library school for children's literature. And there's a character in the book, a good character, named Mr. Hodge. So could you just talk about Frank a little bit, why you dedicated to him, and about his, he runs Hodgepodge Books down on he's going to be actually going to the internet now, but he's almost retired. But how come you dedicated this book to him? I mean,
when I wrote my first manuscript, this is back in around 2001, it was a terrible, terrible manuscript. When I go back and look at what I wrote, it was just awful.
Before your first...
Before Big Slick.
Okay.
Before, every author's got their practice novel. And that was my practice novel. And it was a middle grade fantasy book, a la Harry Potter-ish kind of stuff. And I was in a writing group at the time, and someone in the writing group said, if you're writing for kids, you really need to meet Frank Hodge. I said, well, who's Frank Hodge? Just go into its store. It's on Lark Street, and meet him. And so I poked my head in there, manuscript in hand, and introduced myself. And Frank is one of these people who will sit with you and talk to you, and just like you're talking about the weather, we'll talk about his interactions with Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote A Wrinkle in Time, or E.B. White, his interactions with E.B. White at Cornell, and who wrote Charlotte's Web. And he's just, and people know him nationwide. And, I hid my manuscript when I just started hearing him talk. But after a few visits of just chatting with him, and he was giving me books. He said, if you're going to be a children's writer, you need to...
And this is before you showed him.
Anything. Okay. You need to read this book, and you need to read this book. And he would give me the books right off the shelves in the bookstore and say, just bring them back to me in good condition.
You didn't have to pay for them?
No, and
God.
and I would just bring them back and say, more, more, more. And he would give me stacks of books, and off I'd go and read them. And the books that he put in my hand were the books that were important for me to help me become the writer I am today. And quite frankly, I consider that if I had not met Frank Hodge, I wouldn't ever have been published, period. And, it would have taken me 20, 30 years to be published because of just the tutelage that he gave me off the cuff. I mean, he just exudes children's literature. It's fascinating.
He did that as a teacher. He was a great teacher, wonderful, wonderful guy.
And Frank is closing his store now, and he is hoping to transfer his business to an online presence. Okay. And if you can find him, and I don't know his website offhand, but you can Google it. He is just he's just a treasure trove of information, and he's going to start blogging now, selling books online, and he'll be doing his book recommendations.
Oh, good. So he's still
going strong. At 80, he's going strong. So
I'll just tell people, we didn't talk about your first book, but I'll just mention it. We do have 2 copies in our library. It's called Big Slick, and it's about a teenager who gets a gambling problem.
Yeah, he gets drawn into
online poker, and then
and then into live poker in an illegal poker hall.
Does it take place in Albany?
It takes place in Nowhere's Land.
Okay,
I mean,
so
a lot of the landmarks are Albany-ish. It's an upstate city, but I never mention a city. But
and then the new book that we're talking about, we just finished talking about, Bug Boy, takes place in Saratoga in 1934. It's been getting some really good advance with buzz, you could say, and. You're going to probably be up. Do you have somewhere you're going to be anywhere? And this will probably be on after you're at Stuyvesant Plaza.
Yeah.
But are you going to be around in the summer at Saratoga? Do you know it yet?
I'll be around. I mean, if I recall correctly, my signing in Saratoga is on August 2nd at 12 o'clock.
At the track or at a bookstore?
At the Borders on Broadway. Okay. I'll be on the OTB channel that morning. And,
really?
Yeah, I have some fun things lined up for the summer. I have some exciting. I'm doing a lot of benefits for horse rescue and for the backstretch workers. Because the book is really about them. Yeah. And so I think it's important for me to give back in that way.
Well, do you think, just one more quick thing, you said it in 1934, which sort of really adds a little to it, but do you think it would have been harder to write a 15-year, well, if there's no 15-year-olds, are kids that young working up there at the track, actually? I mean, on, like in the book.
Not as prevalently, but there are young people up there.
So do you think it would have been harder to write a more modern?
Well, yeah, the thing I love about Bug Boy, and I didn't even realize this until after I was finished writing it, was how relevant a lot of the themes are about this instant rise to fame, about this.
Yes, he even sort of he ends up winning his first couple of races, and he has a girlfriend, and they're like the celebrities of Saratoga.
Yeah, well, back in the 30s, the social scene in Saratoga was similar to the social scene in the Hamptons now in the summertime, because the posh, elite would come to Saratoga. They wouldn't go down to as readily down to the beach scene, and so horse racing back in the 30s was the most popular sport in America.
Okay. I guess I did want to ask this. We still have a minute or two. How do you handle? There's some slight. How do you handle sort of the sex in these YA novels? Mm-hmm. Your book doesn't really have, but there's some little intimations of things. Is that? I mean, are there rules that the publishers give you, or you just try to make it as?
It's the litmus test I use is it relevant in some way? Is it important from regards of developing character? Mm-hmm. And there's some very important reasons why, and I would call them suggestive scenes, but I wouldn't call them explicit.
I don't think anyone would ban the book or anything.
But and I don't want to give anything away, but for very important reasons, it's important to show how these two people are connecting and why. Because in the chapter subsequent to that, there are some surprises that you say, wow, things happened in a strange way.
Yes.
And the same thing happened with Big Slick. There's some suggestive scenes in there, not particularly explicit, but I go through not only each scene, but each paragraph, each sentence, and each word in those scenes particularly carefully and say, does this support plot or character or story? Is this important, or can I get rid of it? And if I can get rid of it, it's gone. And I go back and forth with my editor quite closely on those issues.
Well, I mean, as a reader myself, this book, I would say 3 or 4 times, it went where I didn't think it was going to go. It was really, it didn't follow. Again, it could be me and my conception of YA, but it really went in ways I did not think it was going to go. And so, are you working on something now that's down the road?
Absolutely. I just got my 3rd book contract a few months ago. My 3rd book will be with HarperCollins. It comes out in June of 2010, so it's a real quick release. It's called Seth Baumgartner's Love Manifesto. It's another young adult novel, but it's got a technology twist to it that's going to be very interesting.
Well, then, when that comes out, we'll have you back again to talk to us about your book and YA, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Pleasure being here. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, that's it for Meet the Author this time, and we'll see you next time.